stream of consciousness technique. It takes us through the lanes and streets inside our minds, jumping from thought to thought, memory to memory. But what happens when this mind we are traversing has witnessed the trenches and the marshes of the World War, where a soldier looks on helplessly when his friend, his fellow, is blown up into pieces? That is a mind we dare not enter without hesitation. And Virginia Woolf takes us right through it when she makes us look into the mind of Septimus, because the story of Mrs. Dalloway is not just the story of Mrs. Dalloway. The action is speeding up. We are getting curious what will happen to Septimus. So be with me till the end of today's class as we look at not just the mind of Septimus, but how the world perceives that mind and what happens to him and his life story in Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. I left you last day with Septimus Smith thinking about Bradshaw. Who is Bradshaw? Bradshaw is a professional psychologist and he has a philosophy. So we'll first go through the philosophy of Bradshaw, what he thinks is the real trouble with people who have mental health issues. Proportion, divine proportion. Sir William's goddess was acquired by Sir William walking hospitals, catching salmon, begetting one son in Harley Street by Lady Bradshaw. So throughout his life, Bradshaw has acquired, no matter what he is doing, he is having a casual time, he is in a relationship, or he is having a professional walk through a hospital, he has acquired his idea about what proportion means. Worshipping proportion, Sir William not only prospered himself, but made England prosper. How did he contribute to the prosperity of England? By segregating the ones who are struggling with mental health as people in whom there is a lack of proportion. Secluded her lunatics means the lunatics of England. Forbade childbirth, penalized despair, made it impossible for the unfit to propagate their views until they too shared his sense of proportion. His, if they were men, Lady Bradshaw's if they were women. So what was Lady Bradshaw's view about an orderly life? She embroidered, knitted, spent 4 nights out of 7 at home with her son. So that is the kind of ideal life that Mrs. Bradshaw projected onto the ladies who had to follow her, otherwise they would also be called lunatics. Why is Virginia Woolf so bothered about this? Because she was branded as a disturbed individual just because she did not adhere to these domestic codes that were advertised as the ideal life for the housewife or the women. So that not only did his colleagues respect him, his subordinates fear him, but the friends and relations of his patients felt for him the keenest gratitude. Whoever he treated, the relatives of those patients felt very grateful because somehow Bradshaw validated their suffering, that I have a lunatic in my house, and Bradshaw is validating that yes, this person is a lunatic because he has no sense of proportion. So that kind of gave a feeling to the relatives, the caregivers, that he is giving some kind of recognition to our suffering due to this person's lunacy. But proportion has a sister. What sister? Less smiling, more formidable, a goddess. Who is the goddess sister of proportion? Even now engaged in the heat and sands of India, the mud and swamp of Africa, the purlieus of London, wherever, in short, the climate or the devil tempts men to fall from the true belief, which is her own, is even now engaged in dashing down shrines, smashing idols, and setting up in their place her own stern countenance. Conversion is her name. So proportion and conversion, these go hand in hand. This is very important in the colonial context. You see, colonialism banked on the idea that the colonizing country was, or rather considered itself to be morally and culturally superior to the country which is colonized. Therefore, it was the mission of the colonizer to civilize the colonized people. How would that civilization come about? First, by declaring that those people have no sense of proportion, especially when it comes to religion, and therefore the way to correct them is to give them that idea of the perfect religion, and that comes through conversion. So, what Virginia Woolf is doing here is she's connecting a psychological issue with a political one in a very subtle manner, that these two ideas are connected. And in a way, Bradshaw is also converting people, like he is giving them that impression that if you are not a follower of my ideal of proportion, then you must convert yourself, otherwise, I will call you a lunatic. But conversion, fastidious goddess, loves blood better than brick and feasts most subtly on the human will. When somebody gets converted, be it religious conversion, be it philosophical conversion, believing in somebody's way of looking at life, in any conversion, your will is captured. You are no more working under your own free will. And how is this explained in terms of Mrs. Bradshaw's life? For example, Lady Bradshaw. 15 years ago, she had gone under. That is, she had surrendered when she had married Mr. Bradshaw. It was nothing you could put your finger on. There had been no scene, no snap, nobody was scolding her or anything, only the slow sinking waterlogged of her will into his. Look at the tiredness that you can feel from these words, slow sinking, waterlogged. So, subjugation doesn't always have to be through violence, it can also be through a very tiring, long drawn process which Lady Bradshaw was exposed to. And then eventually she had to become, or rather fall in line with the same ideas which her husband promoted. Sweet was her smile, swift her submission. Dinner in Harley Street, numbering 8 or 9 courses, feeding 10 or 15 guests of the professional classes, was smooth and urbane. So her life was all meticulously set, numbered, proportioned. Only as the evening wore on a very slight dullness or uneasiness, perhaps a nervous twitch. It's not that Mrs. Bradshaw did not understand her subjugated position. She was busy in her proportioned life, but there were moments when that facade, that outer layer of illusion broke apart and she could feel that something is missing. And how did she feel that? Through a nervous twitch, maybe? Fumble, stumble, and confusion indicated what it was really painful to believe, that the poor lady lied. So all her life was what? A lie? And then we begin to think that, is Mrs. Dalloway's life also a lie? And what about Septimus? Whose will was he going to surrender to? And then Virginia Woolf gives us a record of how Sir William appeared in front of his patients. There in the grey room, with the pictures on the wall and the valuable furniture under the ground glass skylight, they learned the extent of their transgressions. That is, if you have some kind of mental health issue, it means you have transgressed. So your psychological actions are evaluated as moral transgressions. Huddled up in armchairs, they watched him go through for their benefit. Now, it was always felt by these patients that Mr. Bradshaw was doing them a service, but they felt like they were actually being judged. A curious exercise with the arms which he shot out brought sharply back to his hip to prove, if the patient was obstinate, that Sir William was master of his own actions, which the patient was not. So he always gave them this idea, the patients, this idea that I know what I'm doing. I am in control of my actions, my emotions. You have no control. There, some weakly broke down, sobbed, submitted. Others, inspired by heaven knows what intemperate madness, called Sir William to his face a damnable humbug. So, patients also varied. Some patients were weak, some patients protested, and they would ask, why live? They demanded. Sir William replied that life was good. Certainly, Lady Bradshaw in ostrich feathers hung over the mantelpiece, and as for his income, it was quite 12,000 a year. So, yes, Sir William was a rich man. And looking at that, the patients would say that you have so much, we don't have. We are not rich. Life has not given us much. But to us, they protested, life has given no such bounty. He acquiesced. They lacked a sense of proportion. And then his diagnosis would come that you don't have a sense of proportion. And perhaps, after all, there is no God. He shrugged his shoulders. In short, this living or not living is an affair of our own, but they were mistaken. So, what we gather from here is that Sir William was not at all interested to diagnose his patients with an open mind, with a point of view that was ready to adapt to new ideas, but he was obstinate in promoting his own philosophy, his own idea that suited him best. So, what he does with Septimus is very obvious. He breaks him up even more. And then these lines. He shut people up. It was this combination of decision and humanity that endeared Sir William so greatly to the relations of his victims. Sometimes, the relatives of people who are struggling with mental health issues, they are so tired that when Bradshaw eventually shuts the patient up, they feel relieved. They don't realize that he's not actually treating them but shutting them up. But Rizia Warren Smith cried, walking down Harley Street, that she did not like that man. Right when we are so curious about what's going to happen next, the narrator slips out of the story of Rizia and Septimus and takes us to a very strange location, looking at Lady Bruton, who is now about to have lunch with Mr. Dalloway. Lady Bruton herself preferred Richard Dalloway, who arrived at the next moment. Indeed, they met on the doorstep. Lady Bruton preferred Richard Dalloway, of course. He was made of much finer material. Somehow, there is a difference in the way Lady Bruton looked at Clarissa and her husband. And for her, Richard Dalloway was more suited to her sensibility. She invites Mr. Dalloway, but let us eat first, she said. And so there began a soundless and exquisite passing to and fro through swing doors of aproned white-capped maids, handmaidens not of necessity, but adepts in a mystery or grand deception practiced by hostesses in Mayfair. So, not that they required so many maids to be there, but it gives a kind of visual that they were thriving household and it was part of the conventional setup of the lunch or dinner. And then let's look at how that lunch is described. Little mats, saucers of red fruit, films of brown cream musk turbot, in casseroles severed chickens swim, colored, undomestic. The fire burns, and with the wine and the coffee, not paid for because it was like an invited lunch, rise jocund visions before musing eyes, gently speculative eyes, eyes to whom life appears musical, mysterious. So the formality of the occasion and the hint that there is some kind of an exchange between the hostess and the guest. And we begin to get curious. Is there something going on between Burton and Mr. Dalloway? And then this conversation begins. How is Clarissa? She asked abruptly. Clarissa always said that Lady Bruton did not like her. Indeed, Lady Bruton had the reputation of being more interested in politics than people, of talking like a man. So while Clarissa Dalloway represents one side of the high class urban populace, Lady Bruton is representing a very rare class but which still existed. And they were interested in politics. They could speak for hours on state matters and policies with men. And when this description is given, there is a note of envy detectable somewhere, that Lady Bruton enjoys some kind of additional importance when she is in conversation with men. Like she is not dismissed as if she doesn't know anything. Thus, when she said in her offhand way, "How is Clarissa?" husbands had difficulty in persuading their wives, and indeed, however devoted, were secretly doubtful themselves of her interest in women, who often got in their husbands' way, prevented them from accepting posts abroad, and had to be taken to the seaside in the middle of the session to recover from influenza. So there is a kind of dismissal from her side when she talks about usual housewives whose presence actually drags down the work, the ambition of their husbands. And she tries to always establish herself as somebody different. In this lunch, it's not just Mr. Dalloway, but also Hugh Whitbread, who joins them, and he informs them that he had met Clarissa that day in the park. "I met Clarissa in the park this morning," said Hugh Whitbread, diving into the casserole. So he just gives that information in a casual way. And then Lady Bruton suddenly tells, "Do you know who is in town? Our old friend Peter Walsh." They all smiled. Peter Walsh, and Mr. Dalloway was genuinely glad. So what is it? Does Mr. Dalloway not know that Peter Walsh was his wife's first love? Millie Brush thought, and Mr. Whitbread thought only of his chicken. So Peter Walsh, all three, Lady Bruton, Hugh Whitbread, and Richard Dalloway, remembered the same thing. How passionately Peter had been in love, been rejected, gone to India, come a cropper, made a mess of things, and Richard Dalloway had a very great liking for the dear old fellow too. So this is a very, very subtle way of saying that Mr. Dalloway was glad because Peter Walsh represents failure and Mr. Dalloway represents success, not just professionally but domestically. So presence of Peter Walsh doesn't challenge Richard Dalloway. He rather feels glad because it validates his victory in life. So we'll quickly go over to the part where they leave Lady Bruton, and she was reminded that there's going to be a party that day. "We shall see you at our party tonight," whereupon Lady Bruton resumed the magnificence which letter writing had shattered. She might come or she might not come. Clarissa had wonderful energy. Parties terrified Lady Bruton, but then she was getting old. So she intimated, standing at her doorway. So as Richard and Hugh Whitbread, they were coming out and walking across the street, a very interesting thing happens. Richard ends up standing outside a shop window. And what is inside it? Aware that he was looking at a silver two-handled Jacobean mug, and that Hugh Whitbread admired condescendingly with airs of connoisseurship a Spanish necklace. So they were outside this shop and they were looking at articles. And then Hugh was going into the shop and Richard was following. But, of course, Richard was a private man and he didn't want to buy anything personal for his wife in front of Hugh. So what does he do at this point? The necklace hung stretched between Hugh's admirable fingers. Let him give it to a girl if he must buy jewels. Any girl in the street. And then he begins to think about his daughter also. And then he begins to think about his actions. For he never gave Clarissa presents except a bracelet 2 or 3 years ago, which had not been a success. She never wore it. It pained him to remember that she never wore it. And as a single spider's thread, after wavering here and there, attaches itself to the point of a leaf. That means Richard's mind is compared to a single spider's thread, which is hanging about from thought to thought, and then it gets attached to one particular thought. Who compares minds to spider's thread? Virginia Woolf. So Richard's mind, recovering from its lethargy, set now on his wife. So he started to think about Clarissa, whom Peter Walsh had loved so passionately, and Richard had had a sudden vision of her there at luncheon, of himself and Clarissa, of their life together, and he drew the tray of old jewels towards him. And taking up first this brooch, then that ring, how much is that? He asked, but doubted his own taste, because the last time he gave her something, she didn't wear it. He wanted to open the drawing room door and come in holding out something, a present for Clarissa. Only what? But Hugh was on his legs again. He was unspeakably pompous. So there is a constant interruption in his thought, in his decision making. So in this novel, you will find a lot of circumstances where somebody is about to do something but is interrupted, as if a communication channel is breaking down. That kind of an interruption. But he wanted to come in holding something. Flowers? Yes, flowers. Since he did not trust his taste in gold. Any number of flowers, roses, orchids, to celebrate what was, reckoning things as a well an event. So he wants to buy something for his wife. He feels that he is not very confident in buying an article of gold because he is not sure if his taste matches hers. But flowers are safe option. So it's not that he's ungrateful. He loves his wife. He loves the life with Clarissa. And he rather calls it a miracle, his life with her. He repeated that it was a miracle that he should have married Clarissa. A miracle. His life had been a miracle, he thought, hesitating to cross, but it did make his blood boil to see little creatures of 5 or 6 crossing Piccadilly alone. The police ought to have stopped the traffic at once. So see, on one hand he is thinking about his wife, about his life with her, and on the other he is observing the traffic, commenting on it bitterly. So our minds are actually like that. Emotions, thoughts, all jam into some mental traffic jam, and that creates confusion if we are outsiders looking inside the mind of somebody, that what is he actually thinking about. Coming back to miracles, it was a great age in which to have lived. Indeed, his own life was a miracle. Let him make no mistake about it. Here he was in the prime of life, walking to his house in Westminster to tell Clarissa that he loved her. Happiness is this, he thought. So a sense of completion is there. But can he achieve that complete action, or will that be interrupted? Let's see. It is this, he said as he entered Dean's Yard. Big Ben was beginning to strike. See, the clock is omnipresent. Time is omnipresent. And that's very obvious because it's time. And these bells from the clock, they are a constant reminder of mortality, of the fact that this moment, the moment is gone, and creates a sense of inevitability, which comes as a warning. Yet it is musical because it is a bell. First the warning, musical, then the hour, irrevocable. And in these lines, the novel transforms into pure poetry, doesn't it? Lunch parties waste the entire afternoon, he thought, approaching his door. And that sound which he heard when he was entering his house was also heard by Clarissa in her drawing room. The sound of Big Ben flooded Clarissa's drawing room, where she sat ever so annoyed at her writing table. Worried, annoyed. It was perfectly true that she had not asked Ellie Henderson to her party, but she had done it on purpose. Now Mrs. Marsham wrote she had told Ellie Henderson she would ask Clarissa. Ellie so much wanted to come. So see, she is occupying herself with the small little details of the party that she was about to organize that day, because that party was the center of her life at the moment. And then she's thinking, but why should she invite all the dull women in London to her parties? Why should Mrs. Marsham interfere? And then we have a series of names and what Dalloway thinks about them. And that gives us an impression that Mrs. Dalloway wants very lively people around her. But is she being lively enough? Then why is she attracting dull women in her life? And then Richard comes, and Richard is holding flowers in his hands. Something fumbling, something scratching at the door. Who at this hour? So it's 3 o'clock. Good heavens, 3 already! For with overpowering directness and dignity the clock struck 3, and she heard nothing else. But the door handle slipped round and in came Richard. What a surprise! In came Richard, holding out flowers. She had failed him once at Constantinople, and Lady Bruton, whose lunch parties were said to be extraordinarily amusing, had not asked her. So, was that flower some kind of compensation that she was not invited to that luncheon? He was holding out flowers, roses, red and white roses. But he could not bring himself to say he loved her, not in so many words. The hesitation which comes, the awkwardness which one feels when saying I love you to your own husband or wife, it comes with lack of habit. If you say it every day, it doesn't sound that awkward. But then it's understandable that the shyness which Richard is feeling is definitely because of the lack of practice. They do not have that kind of relationship where he can openly tell her that he loves her. But obviously, Clarissa was overjoyed by the flowers. They were lovely. And she quickly reported to him that Peter Walsh was back, Mrs. Marsham had written. And when she's talking, probably at a high speed, Richard interrupts. But let us sit down for 5 minutes. It all looked so empty. All the chairs were against the wall. What had they been doing? Oh, it was for the party. No, he hadn't forgotten. The party, Peter Walsh was back. Oh, yes. That means he is responding to whatever information she is giving up. She had had him, and he was going to get a divorce, and he was in love with some woman out there, and he hadn't changed in the slightest. There she was, mending her dress, thinking of Bhutan, she said. And then Richard gives his information set to her. Hugh was at lunch, said Richard. She had met him too. Well, he was getting absolutely intolerable, buying Evelyn necklaces, fatter than ever, an intolerable ass. And it came over me, I might have married you, she said, thinking of Peter sitting there in his little bow tie with that knife, opening it, shutting it, just as he always was. So they were talking about him at lunch. That is something that Richard said, that we were talking about Peter Walsh. But he could not tell her he loved her. So they were talking about everything except the one thing that mattered, that he loves her. He held her hand. Happiness is this, he thought. They had been writing a letter to the Times for Millicent Bruton. So in the luncheon, the main object of the luncheon was that Hugh and Mr. Dalloway would help Miss Bruton to write a letter, draft a letter. But somehow we feel that he cannot actually tell her what he wanted to tell her, that he loved her. He saw that Clarissa was truly invested in the party. She wanted to talk about it. If she worried about these parties, he would not let her give them. Did she wish she had married Peter? But he must go. He must be off, he said, getting up. But he stood for a moment as if he were about to say something. Now we are also, as readers, very curious. Does he say, Clarissa, I love you? And she wondered what. Why? They were the roses. So that should be enough to make her feel that this was his way of saying that he loves her. Some committee? She asked as he opened the door. She wanted to know that why are you going out and do you have any work? Armenians, he said, or perhaps it was Albanians. And eventually he wants to take some rest before the party. An hour's complete rest after luncheon, he said, and he went. How like him! He would go on saying an hour's complete rest after luncheon to the end of time because a doctor had ordered it once. It was like him to take what doctors said literally, part of his adorable divine simplicity. So somehow we see that Clarissa looks at her husband with some kind of even condescension, you can say, feels that he is very simple. And this sounds even worse when it is written this way, which made him go and do the thing while she and Peter frittered their time away bickering. So he used to have his 1 hour complete rest after luncheon while Clarissa and Peter had each other during that moment. And how does Clarissa look at these topics that Richard is speaking about? She cared much more for her roses than for the Armenians. Hunted out of existence, maimed, frozen, the victims of cruelty and injustice. She had heard Richard say so over and over again. No, she could feel nothing for the Albanians. Or was it the Armenians? It doesn't even matter to her. Albanians and Armenians are completely different set of people. But for her, it doesn't matter. Because within her small little circle of domesticity, her roses matter. Because that is directly connected to her existence or survival. But she loved her roses. Didn't that help the Armenians? The only flowers she could bear to see cut. So we see her lying on the sofa, and then what happens? She thinks about her parties and what would Peter think about them. Yes, yes, but your parties, what's the sense of your parties? So, all this is going on inside her mind now when she is relaxing on the sofa. All she could say was, and nobody could be expected to understand, they are an offering, which sounded horribly vague. Offering to whom? Offering to herself? Offering to the society? But who was Peter to make out that life was all plain and sailing? Peter always in love with the wrong woman. So Peter always had an exciting life. Clarissa had no excitement. For her, the parties made her survive the boredom of her life. So how would Peter understand the importance of parties when he had a completely different kind of life? But then she begins to think deeper. But to go deeper beneath what people said and these judgments, how superficial, how fragmentary they are. So people judge her. Peter can judge her that she is being shallow in giving so much importance to these parties. But to go deeper in her own mind now, what did it mean to her, this thing she called life? Oh, it was very queer. She felt, what a pity. And she felt if only they could be brought together, so she did it. And it was an offering to combine, to create. But to whom? So parties means what? Get together. Who are getting together? Then she begins to think that way. An offering for the sake of offering, perhaps. Anyhow, it was her gift. Now, you might think along these lines. There was a war which had broken down, at least Europe, people of England. There was gloom all around. And it was Clarissa's way of offering a moment of beauty, a moment of happiness, joy, fun, as her contribution in very small little way, but her contribution towards life. That it's not all about bombing and destruction. It's also about meeting up people, communicating, celebrating. So this is how she is justifying her enthusiasm for her parties. An offering for the sake of offering. Anyhow, it was her gift. Nothing else had she of the slightest importance, could not think, write, even play the piano. She muddled Armenians and Turks, loved success, hated discomfort, must be liked, talked oceans of nonsense, and to this day ask her what the equator was, and she did not know. So it's not that Clarissa was an intellectual or even a knowledgeable person, but she was capable of organizing this moment of fun when people could take a step back from the violence they had witnessed and the destruction they have been through. All the same, that one day should follow another. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. That one should wake up in the morning, see the sky, walk in the park, meet you with bread. And suddenly in came Peter, then these roses. It was enough. After that, how unbelievable death was, that it must end. She understood that life, with all its bits and pieces of experiences, life was so precious, so beautiful, that it's unbelievable it's about to end. And while she's thinking about these things, her daughter comes in, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, till now, was with her tutor, Miss Kilman. And yes, you can have your own ideas about what Miss Kilman represents, especially because her name is so very weird and suggestive. The door opened. Elizabeth knew that her mother was resting. So we are outside the mind of Clarissa now. We are looking at the room and we see that Elizabeth enters the room. She came in very quietly, stood perfectly still, and a very peculiar way to describe her here. Was it that some Mongol had been wrecked on the coast of Norfolk, as Mrs. Hilberry said, had mixed with the Dalloway ladies? So her face had features of the people belong to the Mongol tribe. And what kind of feature? For the Dalloways in general were fair haired, blue eyed. Elizabeth, on the contrary, was dark, had Chinese eyes in a pale face, and oriental mystery, was gentle, considerate still. So somehow Elizabeth was always this different kind of a daughter, different from the Dalloways. So she stood still and looked at her mother. But the door was ajar, and outside the door was Miss Kilman, as Clarissa knew. Miss Kilman in her mackintosh, listening to whatever they said. So, this presence of Miss Kilman is like a constant reminder of her failure as a mother to communicate with her daughter. It's like Miss Kilman comes in the way, interferes. Even when she is not inside the room, Clarissa has this feeling that she is outside listening to their words. Yes, Miss Kilman stood on the landing. That's right. But why did she stand there? And wore a mackintosh, but had her reasons. It's not because she wanted to eavesdrop or listen to what was going on between Clarissa and her daughter. But why was she there in the landing wearing a mackintosh? First, it was cheap. Second, she was over 40 and did not, after all, dress to please. So she wore for whatever was comfortable to her. She was poor, moreover, degradingly poor. Otherwise, she would not be taking jobs from people like the Dalloways, from rich people who liked to be kind. So, kindness was an option. It was not a necessary thing, but it's optional. And when you show kindness, it's basically you're pleasing yourself, that kind of a kindness. And then suddenly we are taken to the life of Miss Kilman. She had been cheated. Yes, the word was no exaggeration. For surely a girl has a right to some kind of happiness, and she had never been happy. What with being so clumsy and so poor? Now, because of her poverty, she didn't get what she wanted from life. And then, just as she might have had a chance at Miss Dolby's school, the war came. So, see, the World War has this overpowering presence in this novel. In every character's life, it has some kind of effect. Miss Dolby thought she would be happier with people who shared her views about the Germans. She had had to go. It was true that the family was of German origin, but her brother had been killed. They turned her out. So now we're listening to the story of Kilman's schoolmistress, Miss Dolby. And then what happened to Miss Kilman? She had had to take whatever she could get. Mr. Dalloway had come across her working for the Friends. He had allowed her, and that was really generous of him, to teach his daughter history. I wonder what kind of history she would teach. Also, she did a little extension lecturing and so on. Then our Lord had come to her. So it's history that she was supposed to teach, but she ended up teaching her lessons of religion, morality, and those things. She had seen the light 2 years and 3 months ago. Before that, she was not a believer in that way. Now she is like kind of completely converted into a devout Christian. Now she did not envy women like Clarissa Dalloway. She pitied them. Now, usually in the lessons of Christianity, and in many great religions, it said that you shouldn't envy your neighbor and things like that. So, with this line, there's a subtle hint that she actually envies Clarissa Dalloway, but since she is a devout Christian now, she cannot admit even to herself that she envies her. So she tells that I pity her. She pitied and despised them from the bottom of her heart as she stood on the soft carpet looking at the old engravings of a little girl with a muff. With all this luxury going on, what hope was there for a better state of things? With her state of poverty, she actually doesn't like the fact that Clarissa and her house was so rich and luxurious. Instead of lying on a sofa, my mother was resting. So it's like she is really being envious here. Elizabeth had said she should have been in a factory behind a counter. Mrs. Dalloway and all the other fine ladies. So she is actually envious and she wants them working hard like the majority of poor women back in that time. And it's not very unnatural of her to think that way. We shouldn't be judgmental because think about the whole thing from her point of view. Bitter and burning, Miss Kilman had turned into a church 2 years, 3 months ago. She had heard the Reverend Edward Whittaker preach, the boys sing, had seen the solemn lights descend, and whether it was the music or the voices, the hot and turbulent feelings which boiled and surged in her had been assuaged. So she got her consolation in church. She wept after that, and then somehow believed that the Lord was showing her the way. So now, whenever the hot and painful feelings boiled within her, this hatred of Mrs. Dalloway, this grudge against the world, she thought of God. She thought of Mr. Whittaker. Rage was succeeded by calm. A sweet savour filled her veins. Her lips parted, and standing formidable upon the landing in her mackintosh. Mackintosh is that raincoat kind of thing. She looked with steady and sinister serenity. Steady and sinister serenity? How can you call serenity sinister? That's a horrible oxymoron there. Opposite words together. So her serenity is not real, not actual, but it's like she's convincing herself that she is serene. Elizabeth said she had forgotten her gloves. That was because Miss Kilman and her mother hated each other. She could not bear to see them together. She ran upstairs to find her gloves. So when Elizabeth saw that her mother was there and Miss Kilman was there, she hated to see them together because she knew the hatred between them. So in order to escape them, she made this excuse that I don't have gloves with me, and she ran away to her room to bring them back. How did Clarissa look at Miss Kilman? It's very interesting here. Clarissa was really shocked. This is a Christian. This woman had taken her daughter from her. She in touch with invisible presences, heavy, ugly, commonplace, without kindness or grace. She know the meaning of life. But when she is speaking to Miss Kilman, she doesn't show that much of antagonism. You are taking Elizabeth to the stores? Miss Kilman said she was. They stood there. So it's like two opponents standing in front of each other. So they were going to the stores. Odd it was, as Miss Kilman stood there, and stand she did with the power and taciturnity of some prehistoric monster armored for primeval warfare. So in the eyes of Clarissa Dalloway, Kilman was just not an opponent, but also somebody who was ready to fight her with weapons and armor. And then they go off. Off they went together, Miss Kilman and Elizabeth, downstairs. With a sudden impulse, with a violent anguish, for this woman was taking her daughter from her. Now, suddenly Clarissa was almost in a panic, and she felt like her daughter was going away from her. Going away doesn't mean physically going away from her, but emotionally getting distanced. So she wants to stop that. And in her panic, what is the thing she says? She cries out, "Remember the party! Remember our party tonight!" Doesn't she sound really helpless at this moment that she has to say the words as if the party is a reason for which her daughter should come back? Like she is not good enough. She needs a reason for her to return to this house. So, this desperation, you know, this inability to actually say what we want to say to our own people, our parents, our spouses, that is the story of Mrs. Dalloway. We might feel that we cannot tell our story to the world, we cannot express to the outsiders, but can we express to our own people? That is the story of Mrs. Dalloway. And because Miss Kilman is using religion as a tool to take her daughter away from her, Clarissa ends up hating religion. Love and religion, thought Clarissa, going back into the drawing room, tingling all over. How detestable they are. For now that the body of Miss Kilman was not before her, it overwhelmed her. The idea. So when Miss Kilman was there in front of her, she has a size. When she is not there, then she grows out of proportion. The cruelest things in the world, she thought, seeing them clumsy, hot, domineering, hypocritical, eavesdropping, jealous, infinitely cruel and unscrupulous, dressed in a Mackintosh coat on the landing. Everything that is bad, everything that is ugly, is represented by the figure of Miss Kilman for Clarissa. Love and religion. Had she ever tried to convert anyone herself? Did she not wish everybody merely to be themselves? With Clarissa, it's like live and let live. She never wants anybody to become like her, to think like her, probably because she doesn't have a very fixed set of ideas about anything herself. But still, she believes in accepting people as they are. And Miss Kilman is exactly the opposite. She wants converts, and in this, she is very much like Bradshaw, who also prioritizes proportion, conversion. Love destroyed too. Everything that was fine, everything that was true went. Take Peter Walsh now. There was a man, charming, clever, with ideas about everything. If he wanted to know about Pope, say, or Addison, or just to talk nonsense, what people were like, what things meant, Peter knew better than anyone. It was Peter who had helped her, Peter who had lent her books. But look at the women he loved. Vulgar, trivial, commonplace. Think of Peter in love. He came to see her after all these years, and what did he talk about? Himself. Horrible passion, she thought, degrading passion. So love has not made Peter better because he is still the same selfish, self centered, megalomaniac person that he was. And then the clock reminds us that it's half hour, that is half past something. We don't know something what, probably 4:30. Big Ben struck the half hour. And as the story progresses, we are taken along a ride with Miss Kilman and Elizabeth, where we have some more revelations on what Kilman thinks of life, what she thinks of Clarissa, and what this relationship between Kilman and Elizabeth is all about. And what final choice does Elizabeth make? Does she come back to her mother or does she stay with Kilman? For that, you'll have to wait for the next video. We'll soon bring that up. So stay subscribed. This is Monami Mukherjee signing off. Catch you later.